Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Kallipolis Radio. Today, I'll be reading the essay On the Suffering of the World by Arthur Schopenhauer. Thanks for listening. If the immediate and direct purpose of our life is not suffering, then our existence is the most ill-adapted to its purpose in the world. For it is absurd to suppose that the endless affliction of which the world is everywhere full, and which arises out of the need and distress pertaining essentially to life, should be purposeless and purely accidental. Each individual misfortune, to be sure, seems an exceptional occurrence, but misfortune in general is the rule. Just as a stream flows smoothly on, as long as it encounters no obstruction, so the nature of man and animal is such that we never really notice or become conscious of what is agreeable to our will. If we are to notice something, our will has to have been thwarted, has to have experienced a shock of some kind. On the other hand, all that opposes, frustrates, and resists our will, that is to say, all that is unpleasant and painful, impresses itself upon us instantly, directly, and with great clarity. Just as we are conscious not of the healthiness of our whole body, but only of the little place where the shoe pinches, so we think not of the totality of our successful activities, but of some insignificant trifle or other which continues to vex us. On this fact is founded what I have often before drawn attention to, the negativity of well-being and happiness, in antithesis to the positivity of pain. I therefore know of no greater absurdity, which characterizes almost all metaphysical systems, that of explaining evil as something negative. For evil is precisely that which is positive, that which makes itself palpable, and good, on the other hand, i.e., all happiness and all gratification, is that which is negative, the mere abolition of a desire, and the extinction of a pain. This is also consistent with the fact that, as a rule, we find pleasure much less pleasurable, pain much more painful than we expected. A quick test of the assertion that enjoyment outweighs pain in this world, or that they are at any rate balanced, would be to compare the feelings of an animal engaged in eating another with those of the animal being eaten. The most effective consolation in every misfortune and every affliction is to observe others who are more unfortunate than we, and everyone can do this. But what does that say for the condition of the whole? History shows us the life of nations, and finds nothing to narrate but wars and tumults. The peaceful years appear only as occasional brief pauses and interludes. In just the same way, the life of the individual is a constant struggle, and not merely a metaphorical one against want or boredom, but also an actual struggle against other people. He discovers adversaries everywhere, lives in continual conflict, and dies with sword in hand. Not the least of the torments which plague our existence is the constant pressure of time, which never lets us so much as draw breath, but pursues us all like a taskmaster with a whip. It ceases to persecute only him it has delivered over to boredom. And yet, just as our body would burst asunder if the pressure of the atmosphere were removed from it, so would the arrogance of men expand, if not to the point of bursting, then to that of the most unbridled folly, indeed madness, if the pressure of want, toil, calamity, and frustration were removed from their life. One can even say that we require at all times a certain quantity of care or sorrow or want, as a ship requires ballast, in order to keep on a straight course. Work, worry, toil, and trouble are indeed the lot of almost all men their whole life long. And yet, if every desire were satisfied, as soon as it arose, how would men occupy their lives? How would they pass the time? Imagine this race transported to a utopia where everything grows of its own accord and turkeys fly around already roasted, where lovers find one another without any delay, and keep one another without any difficulty. In such a place, some men would die of boredom or hang themselves. Some would fight and kill one another, and thus they would create for themselves more suffering than nature inflicts on them as it is. Thus, for a race such as this, no stage, no form of existence, is suitable other than the one it already possesses. Since, as we recalled above, pleasure and well-being is negative and suffering positive, the happiness of a given life is not to be measured according to the joys and pleasures it contains, but according to the absence of the positive element, the absence of suffering. This being so, however, the lot of the animals appears more endurable than that of man. Let us look at both a little more closely. However varied the forms may be which human happiness and misery assume, inciting man to seek the one and flee from the other, the material basis of them all is physical pleasure or physical pain. This basis is very narrow. It consists of health, food, protection from wet and cold, and sexual gratification, or the lack of these things. Man has, consequently, no larger share of real physical pleasure than the animals have, except perhaps to the extent that his more highly charged nervous system intensifies every sensation of pleasure, as it also does every sensation of pain. And yet, how much stronger are the emotions aroused in him than those aroused in the animals? How incomparably more profound and vehement are his passions, and all to achieve exactly the same result in the end: health, food, covering, etc. This arises first and foremost because, with him, everything is powerfully intensified by thinking about absent and future things, and this is in fact the origin of care, fear, and hope, which, once they have been aroused, make a far stronger impression on men than do actual present pleasures or sufferings, to which the animal is limited. For, since it lacks the faculty of reflection, joys and sorrows cannot accumulate in the animal, as they do in man through memory and anticipation. With the animal, present suffering, even if repeated countless times, remains what it was the first time. It cannot sum itself up. Hence the enviable composure and unconcern which characterizes the animal. With man, on the other hand, there evolves out of those elements of pleasure and suffering which he has in common with the animal an intensification of his sensations of happiness and misery, which can lead to momentary transports, which may sometimes even prove fatal, or to suicidal despair. More closely considered, what happens is this: he deliberately intensifies his needs, which are originally scarcely harder to satisfy than those of the animal, so as to intensify his pleasure. Hence, luxury, confectionery, tobacco, opium, alcoholic drinks, finery, and all that pertains to them. To these is then added, also as a result of reflection, a source of pleasure, and consequently suffering, available to him alone, and one which preoccupies him beyond all measure, indeed more than all the rest put together. Ambition and the sense of honor and shame, in plain words, what he thinks others think of him. This, in 1,000, often curious shapes, then becomes the goal of all those endeavors of his which go beyond physical pleasure or pain. He excels the animal in his capacity for enjoying intellectual pleasures, to be sure, and these are available to him in many degrees, from the simplest jesting and conversation up to the highest achievements of the mind. But as a counterweight to this, on the side of suffering stands boredom, which is unknown to the animals, at least in the state of nature, and is only very slightly perceptible in the very cleverest domesticated ones, while to man it has become a veritable scourge. Want and boredom are indeed the twin poles of human life. Finally, it remains to be mentioned that with man, sexual gratification is tied to a very obstinate selectivity, which is sometimes intensified into a more or less passionate love. Thus, sexuality becomes for man a source of brief pleasure and protracted suffering. It is indeed remarkable how, through the mere addition of thought, which the animal lacks, there should have been erected on the same narrow basis of pain and pleasure that the animal possesses so vast and lofty a structure of human happiness and misery, and man should be subjected to such vehement emotions, passions, and convulsions, that their impress can be read in enduring lines on his face, while all the time and in reality he is concerned only with the very same things which the animal too attains, and attains with an incomparably smaller expenditure of emotion. Through all this, however, the measure of suffering increases in man far more than the enjoyment, and it is very greatly enhanced specifically by the fact that he actually knows of death, while the animal only instinctively flees it, without actually knowing of it, and therefore without ever really having it in view, which man does all the time. The animals are much more content with mere existence than we are. The plants are completely so, and man is so according to how dull and insensitive he is. The animal's life consequently contains less suffering, but also less pleasure than the human's, the direct reason being that, on the one hand, it is free from care and anxiety and the torments that attend them, but on the other is without hope, and therefore has no share in that anticipation of a happy future, which, together with the enchanting products of the imagination which accompany it, is the source of most of our greatest joys and pleasures. The animal lacks both anxiety and hope, because its consciousness is restricted to what is clearly evident, and thus to the present moment. The animal is the present, incarnate, but precisely because this is, so it appears, in one respect to be truly sagacious compared with us, namely in its peaceful, untroubled enjoyment of the present, its obvious composure often puts to shame our own frequently restless and discontented condition. If the above discussion has demonstrated that the reason man's life is more full of suffering than the animal's is his greater capacity for knowledge, we can now trace this back to a more general law, and thus attain to a much more comprehensive view. Knowledge is in itself always painless. Pain affects only the will, and consists in an obstruction, impediment, or frustration of it. Nonetheless, this frustration of the will, if it is to be felt as physical pain, is conditioned by the nerves and their connection with the brain, so that an injury to a limb is not felt if the nerves leading from the limb to the brain are severed, or the brain itself is devitalized by chloroform. That spiritual pain is conditional upon knowledge goes without saying, and it is easy to see that it will increase with the degree of knowledge. We can thus express the whole relationship figuratively by saying that the will is the string, its frustration or impediment the vibration of the string, knowledge the sounding board, and pain the sound. Now, this means that not only inorganic matter, but the plant too, is incapable of feeling pain, however many frustrations its will may undergo. On the other hand, every animal, even an infusorium, suffers pain, because knowledge, however imperfect, is the true characteristic of animality. At each higher stage of animal life, there is a corresponding increase in pain. In the lowest animals, it is extremely slight, but even in the highest, it nowhere approaches the pain which man is capable of feeling, since even the highest animals lack thought and concepts. And it is right that this capacity for pain should reach its zenith only where, by virtue of the existence of reason, there also exists the possibility of denial of the will, for otherwise it would be nothing but aimless cruelty. In our early youth we sit before the life that lies ahead of us, like children sitting before the curtain in a theater, in happy and tense anticipation of whatever is going to appear. Luckily, we do not know what will really appear, for to him who does know, children can sometimes seem like innocent delinquents, sentenced not to death but to life, who have not yet discovered what their punishment will consist of. Nonetheless, everyone desires to achieve old age. That is to say, a condition in which one can say, "Today it is bad, and day by day it will get worse," until at last the worst of all arrives. If you imagine, insofar as it is approximately possible, the sum total of distress, pain, and suffering of every kind which the sun shines upon in its course, you will have to admit that it would have been much better if the sun had been able to call up the phenomenon of life as little on the earth as on the moon, and if, here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline condition. You can still, also, look upon our life as an episode unprofitably disturbing the blessed calm of nothingness. In any case, even he who has found life tolerably bearable will, the longer he lives, feel more clearly that, on the whole, it is a disappointment, nay, a cheat. If two men who were friends in youth meet in old age after the lapse of an entire generation, the principal feeling, the sight of one another, linked as it is with recollections of earlier years, will arouse in both, will be one of total disappointment with the whole of life, which once lay so fair between them in the rosy dawn of youth, promised so much and performed so little. This feeling will dominate so decidedly over every other that they will not even think it necessary to speak of it, but will silently assume it as the basis of their conversation. If the act of procreation were neither the outcome of a desire, nor accompanied by feelings of pleasure, but rather a matter to be decided on the basis of purely rational considerations, is it likely that the human race would still exist? Would each of us not rather have felt so much pity for the coming generation as to prefer to spare it the burden of existence, or at least not wish to take it upon himself to impose that burden upon it in cold blood? For the world is hell, and men are on the one hand the tormented souls, and on the other hand the devils in it. Brahma is supposed to have created the world by a kind of fall into sin, or by an error, and has to atone for this sin or error by remaining in it himself until he has redeemed himself out of it. Very good. In Buddhism, the world arises as a consequence of an inexplicable clouding of the heavenly clarity of the blessed state of nirvana after a long period of quietude. Its origin is thus a kind of fatality, which is fundamentally to be understood in a moral sense, notwithstanding the case has an exact analogy in the physical world, in the origin of the sun, in an inexplicable primeval streak of mist. Subsequently, however, as a consequence of moral misdeeds, it gradually deteriorates physically, too, until it has assumed its present sad condition. Excellent! To the Greeks, the world and the gods were the work of an unfathomable necessity. That will do as a provisional explanation. Ormuzd is continually at war with Ahriman. That is worth considering. But that a god like Jehovah should create this world of want and misery, animi causa, and die gaieté de cœur, and then go so far as to applaud himself for it, saying it is all very good, that is quite unacceptable. Even if Leibniz's demonstration that this is the best of all possible worlds were correct, it would still not be a vindication of divine providence. For the Creator created not only the world, he also created possibility itself. Therefore, he should have created the possibility of a better world than this one. In general, however, two things cry out against any such view of the world as the successful work of an infinitely wise, infinitely good, and at the same time infinitely powerful being, the misery of which it is full, and the obvious imperfection of its most highly developed phenomenon, man, who is indeed a grotesque caricature. This is a dissonance that cannot be resolved. On the contrary, it is precisely these instances which support what we have been saying, and which provide evidence for our conception of the world as the product of our own sins, and therefore as something that had better not have been. Under the former conception, they become a bitter indictment of the Creator, and supply material for cynicisms, while under our conception they appear as an indictment of our own nature and will, and one calculated to teach us humility, for they lead us to the insight that, like the children of libertine fathers, we come into the world already encumbered with guilt, and that it is only because we have continually to atone for this guilt that our existence is so wretched, and its end is death. Nothing is more certain than that, generally speaking, it is the grievous sin of the world, which gives rise to the manifold and great suffering of the world, whereby is meant not any physical empirical connection, but a metaphysical one. The story of the fall is consequently the only thing which reconciles me to the Old Testament. I even regard it as the sole metaphysical truth contained in that book, even though it does appear clothed in allegory. For our existence resembles nothing so much as the consequence of a misdeed, punishment for a forbidden desire. As a reliable compass for orientating yourself in life, nothing is more useful than to accustom yourself to regarding this world as a place of atonement, a sort of penal colony. When you have done this, you will order your expectations of life according to the nature of things, and no longer regard the calamities, sufferings, torments, and miseries of life as something irregular and not to be expected, but will find them entirely in order, well knowing that each of us here is being punished for his existence, and each in his own particular way. This outlook will enable us to view the so-called imperfections of the majority of men, i.e., their moral and intellectual shortcomings, and the facial appearance resulting therefrom, without surprise, and certainly without indignation, for we shall always bear in mind where we are, and consequently regard every man first and foremost as a being who exists only as a consequence of his culpability, and whose life is an expiation of the crime of being born. The conviction that the world, and therefore man too, is something which really ought not to exist, is in fact calculated to instill in us indulgence towards one another. For what can be expected of beings placed in such a situation as we are? From this point of view, one might indeed consider that the appropriate form of address between man and man ought to be, not monsieur, sir, but fellow-sufferer and companion of miseries. However strange this may sound, it corresponds to the nature of the case, makes us see other men in a true light, and reminds us of what are the most necessary of all things: tolerance, patience, forbearance, and charity, which each of us needs, and which each of us, therefore, owes.